We are studying some of the most important minds that have shaped Western history and, in a way, global history, because good or bad, Western institutions and practices, a lot of them have circulated globally. Sometimes with resistance, sometimes with cruelty, whatever. That's it. And what you will be learning is responses by thinkers that have become part of a tradition of how to think about politics. So we're a long, long way away from the dinner table conversation where someone's a liberal and someone's a Labour and someone's a Green or whatever. We're not doing any of that. You leave that at the door. What I'm interested in here is that you are able to think with the help of these thinkers. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you need to know them. And it's like a repertoire. And I can assure you, I've been doing this a long time. Look how grizzled and old I am. I've been doing this a long time, and I can assure you that the stuff you're reading has had enormous importance, even with people who don't realise it's important. And it's of very high quality generally. There may be some exceptions to that about the quality, but in the main, they're a part of a tradition because enough people have in some ways been seized by the way they've thought about the world and that they're responding to. So they're responding to circumstances, and a lot of my job will be to fill out the circumstances to which they're responding so you can read them clearly. Now I have to say, in a general history of political thought subject, which this is, it's quite common for teachers to get you very textually focused, and very often they tend to omit or play down the circumstances in which the book is written. Now, I don't deny that there's value in reading extremely closely. I also don't deny that much of what you read, and beginning with Plato, the first person that we'll look at, much of what you read has relevance now, even. But I don't want you to filter through and think, well, I know what the world is around me now, and I know everything that's going on, so I can judge how good this or that is. I really implore you on my knees, I beg you to put yourself aside. So this is very different to some courses which try to put you right in the middle of everything. I want you to put yourself aside and dissolve into something bigger than yourself. And at this stage, I can safely say, and to deliver yourself over to people that have thought more about these issues, a lot more than you have. And people, as I said, that have left their mark. So there will be an essay, and in the essay, I want you to focus on what's called the primary readings. And although I give you sections each week, when you come to write the essay, I want you to read the whole book from which the reading has come. Or, when it's really big, like Calvin's Institutes, at least have a very good idea of what's going on. You don't have to read every page of the work like that. So when we get to John Calvin, has anyone not heard of John Calvin? Okay. You see, you don't know it. You may have heard of Calvinism, you've heard of Protestantism. I could say without a shadow of a doubt, I think Calvin is one of the most significant people that have ever put pen to paper in terms of changing the institutions that previously people lived in and helping form and shape the institutions which we now inhabit. Even though he's primarily considered a religious figure, which he is. And one of the things you see, once we leave Plato and Aristotle behind, we're going to do a number of weeks on religion. And why is that? Can anyone tell me why I might do that?
It's relation to politics. How a lot of leaders establish their leadership, they were chosen by God to lead.
That's right. In fact, in the ancient world, and we will talk about this more, but in the pre-modern world, Everybody had their gods. And that was universal. That's really an interesting phenomenon. The way people thought prior to philosophy as well was a very visceral and an imaginative way, is how we would put it in our modern terms. And one of the things I like you to do, or I like to do with you, is try and rip out for the first half of the course your more naturally abstract way of thinking, which owes a lot to Plato, but even more to certain modern philosophers, and try and just have a sense for a way of thinking that a lot of people in the world still think like, but is rarely the way that people who have a higher education and go to university in the Western world think like. Or they might think like that in private, but not in public. But in the ancient world, all political orders, in some way, I'm repeating myself, I know for these two who attended another class, because I do think this is so important. All political authorities, in some ways, had their power approved of, sealed, if you like, stamp or seal of approval by the gods. And given that most people today, whether rightly or wrongly, even if they believe in God, tend not to believe in the gods in the West, apart from me, as you know, having problems with gods of technology and others who thwart me, the god of room bookings, for example. These kind of things. So I will try and get you to imagine yourself in that world and get a sense of why it was that people did think like that and what it was that philosophy changed. And it changed it forever, but it didn't do it immediately. Because one thing we will see is that although Plato and Aristotle come along and they speak very theoretically, and they speak in a way which is more from the understanding, working with ideas and concepts, rather than with just a tradition which is much more imaginative, you could say, that comes from the figurative imagination, and that is that people had intimations of things, sensed things which they took as very real and prayed to these gods. And in the city-states, when we look at them, we'll see that different city-states in ancient Greece, for example, they had their gods that looked after them. So, that's one of the things you'll notice with me as I do a lot of associative thinking. Just bear with me, and sometimes I end up somewhere in the book. Now, why did I go there originally? But the point I'm wanting to make here is that I will be getting you to read the primary text, and I will be getting you to see the different changes in thinking. And thirdly, as I said, within Europe, up until around the 17th century, even though there's a few people doing it beforehand, the philosophical way of thinking did not have the kind of influence it has after the 17th and 18th century. And then even then it was slow to come, but now it's just everywhere. So just some of the things I say, I'm anticipating what you will see with your own eyes and recognize when we get there. But one of the things I should say about the way I teach as well, I jump forwards and backwards. And I do that for a reason, so that when you eventually get to something, you will have heard about it before. And one of the reasons I do that is because I believe in the comparative method. I think you understand things far better, and the master of this was Aristotle, who we will look at next week. But I think you see things much better if you compare them. If you don't compare things, I don't think you've got enough scope to really understand what something is. So you see things in relationship to each other. So, coming back a step, one of the things about European culture prior to its modern formation and the way people spoke and the kind of appeals, what they were appealing to, that's what I mean by appeals, what they appeal to, what they hold as most important, was that even when there were philosophers, say in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century, which there were, they tended to be working within the church. And if you think about the church tells stories. Believers read their true stories. I'm not saying they're true or not true. I'm just saying they are narratives. The Bible is a narrative. The Gospels are narratives. They speak in parable. They speak through example. They speak in a way that is very different to a philosophical argument. Even though I think we end up, even with the philosophers, we always resort back to stories of some sort to fill in the gaps. Because I think our concepts and our ideas are always fuzzy around the edges. So stuff gets made up and we're just accepted. Okay. So within the ancient world and within Christendom, so we're talking about the West here, but within Christendom, people took their orientation from the gods and the stories about the gods, and of course the Christian stories were very different to the pagan stories. Okay. Even though that's not too bad. So the Christian, and so it was a world in which stories were ubiquitous. Now we have stories for TV, stories for movies, stories in novels, and then we have something called the truth, the true stuff. So if I go to court and say, look, the reason I was going to kill my son is because God told me to do it, that goes in the mad basket, whereas that is the story of Abraham and Isaac, even though the angels stayed from his hand. Okay, are you with me? Are you with me so far? Also, when I talk about the Greeks, because we'll be talking about the Christians, I will at times be making comparison with the Jewish people, who of course are the authors of, the founders of, the biblical worldview, and Christianity is an outgrowth, even though it's a radical outgrowth that ends up, or that rejects its origin, it nevertheless retains it through retaining, what's the key? The Old Testament, which is basically a Jewish Bible in a bit of a different order, essentially. Okay. So, I want you to focus upon the primary text. We will be going chronologically, but I'll be zooming in and out of things. And when we start talking about Plato, which I'll do very shortly, then I want you to recognize that he pulled a great big lever, if you like. That there was a Gestalt switch. Now, it wasn't something that affected everybody. It affected very few people for a very long time. But the revival of philosophy in the modern world means it changes all our institutions. And I'll explain later why, for example, I think the French Revolution, which I'm doing in detail with a couple here in another course, why that is such a huge tipping point, and the thinkers that helped create the set of appeals, the ideas that motivated and mobilized people, especially the intelligentsia in steering that revolution, why that is so significant to the world you live in. Really, really important. So you might gather from the way I'm speaking, the way I think, I stretch across millennia and centuries. And I'm looking comparatively at what is going on, because I'm trying to look at the world as something in process. And some of these figures have a huge part in changing processes. They are events. They are major figures. And certain things that we will look at, very often it's war and revolution. And when we come to talk about Socrates and Plato, what is it that makes it so important? It's a war. And you can see that Socrates and Plato, in many ways, although there is a philosophical tradition that exists before them, they up the ante of that tradition. They bring all this stuff together because the war has created a belief in them that the world cannot carry on the way it has. And most of the thinkers that we will look at, we will see, are respondents to some kind of cataclysm. Now, again, it's very easy to do courses like this and put that to one side. I think that is a big mistake. Okay. Now, why do I tell you that? Why do I tell you how other people do it and how I do it? Because if you start picking up other books, you'll quickly see that people argue, professors argue, and writers of books argue all the time about the meaning of different things. At the end of the day, I would love to equip you so you think for yourself, so you've got a repertoire to think with. But as I said, I think unless you know a lot of history, I'm helping you do that by filling in some historical gaps. So often the lecture will be a lot about what's going on around it before we actually get to the thinkers in the text. Any questions thus far? Okay. All smooth. That's great. That makes me very happy. So overall, I've given you the idea. Trying to convey to you the kinds of approach I will adopt throughout the course and the kinds of things that we will focus upon and the stretch that we're looking at. Okay, let's begin with Plato and Socrates. It is Plato that writes the first really great work of political philosophy. He had a student called Aristotle. Aristotle tells us that it was someone else that wrote as a philosopher about politics, but we had no work or nothing from that person, and it certainly didn't have the impact of Plato. Secondly, someone who really wrote about politics, that is a certain aspect of politics, but not really asking the kind of questions that Plato did, is a character called Thucydides. Has anyone heard of Thucydides? Thucydides. Has anyone heard of him? Thucydides was a general in the Peloponnesian Wars. The Peloponnesian Wars was a protracted war that existed between the Spartans and the Athenians. Plato and Socrates and Aristotle were Athenians. Aristotle wasn't born there, but that's not a hero there. He set up the academy there, or rather Plato had set up the academy and he taught there as well. The word academy, what does that mean?
Academia.
Academia. That's